Wandering Relics, Chapter 3. The House Where the Oak Leaves Fall. Before I ever set foot in the city of orange-tiled roofs, I had lived 18 years in a small orphanage tucked deep in the northern countryside. Not the gentle pastoral village of woodcut prints, with golden barley fields and crystal blue glacial rivers. This was a poor land, where clay roads clung to your shoes after every rainfall, where red-painted wooden houses nestled quietly beneath towering pines and birches. The orphanage stood at the end of the village, a long three-bay building with a sloping roof, its walls built of gray sandstone now covered in moss. In the front yard sat an old swing, its chains rusted, creaking like a sad whisper every time a child climbed on. In winter, snow buried every corner in white. Snowflakes landed silently on the window frames and melted slowly as warmth from the hearth seeped out. In summer, wildflowers bloomed yellow on the hillsides, and swallows returned to build their nests under the eaves. They made themselves a temporary shelter, then flew away when the wind turned cold. I often watched them, thinking that perhaps I was only a swallow myself, born in a nest that was never truly mine. I cannot remember exactly when I was brought there. In my memory, those first years are only a jumble of thin barley porridge, nights curled up under a threadbare wool blanket, and the crying of other children. Some winter nights, I would wake to the howl of wind through the cracks, and through the darkness I would hear a newborn baby, just arrived, crying for its mother. And I could no longer remember my mother's face. Perhaps I had never known it. Perhaps I was born a nameless child, rootless, simply existing between sheets faded from countless washings. The orphanage was run by a woman in her 60s. We called her the Headmistress. She had silver-white hair streaked with platinum, gray eyes as sad as the Nordic sky before rain, and rough hands that never lacked tenderness. She lived with 2 young teachers from a nearby town. They taught us to read and write, but the most important lessons I learned were not from the alphabet. They were from the way the teachers patiently unpicked wool scarves caught on door handles, the way they sat by our beds when a child had a fever, the way they quietly lit candles by the window every Christmas so that orphan children would know that there was still light in this world. Around the orphanage, barley fields stretched all the way to the pine forest. In spring, the ice melted on small streams, and the water rippled like a distant piano. In summer, the sun never truly set. Those white nights stretched on forever, and we would sit on the grass watching the enormous sky where clouds drifted very slowly. In autumn, oak and birch leaves fell thick as a golden carpet. The older children, myself among them, would rake the leaves in exchange for a slice of toasted bread with bilberry jam. In winter, when snow piled so high that every wooden door groaned when opened, we huddled together by the great hearth, listening to the headmistress tell stories about forest fairies, Viking ships, and a city far to the south, a city by the bay, with orange-tiled roofs and a sea that never stopped singing. It was from those stories that I first heard the name Mina Dromar's Stad. I grew up waiting, but not for a miracle. I learned early that miracles were not for children like me. I waited for the day I would be old enough to leave. The families who came to adopt always chose the youngest children. The smaller, the better. They were easier to shape, easier to love, and they had not yet carried wounds that had scarred over. I watched it happen so many times. My younger siblings dressed in new woolen clothes led by the hand out through the iron gate, and the gate closed behind them. Each time, my heart swelled with a tangled feeling, joy for them, and a quiet grief for myself. The afternoon I left the orphanage was a late autumn day. Golden oak leaves fell on the stone path, and the smell of decaying wood from the forest behind hung in the air. The headmistress walked with me all the way to the bus stop, a humble roadside shelter with a faded wooden sign bearing the village name. She handed me a thin envelope containing the little money she had saved. But the greatest gift she gave me was not money. It was a Clover bracelet she had braided over the summer. "You are a child who understands too much," she said, holding my hand in her warm palm. "You understand so much that it breaks my heart. That can be a compliment, but it can also be a burden, because children who understand too much rarely dare to ask for what they deserve. I hope you learn to ask, my dear." I nodded, afraid to speak, because if I opened my mouth I would surely cry. I only held her hand tightly for a long moment, then climbed onto the old yellow bus. Through the window I watched her stand there, her red scarf fluttering in the wind. She grew smaller and smaller, then disappeared behind the line of birch trees. I knew that from that moment on I had crossed the threshold into another life, a life in which I would have to make my own light. That morning I needed no alarm. The church bells tolled from the gray stone tower, 6 deep, resonant chimes spreading across the orange roofs, still wet with dew. I opened my eyes in the attic room, and for the first second I was lost. Low ceiling, white curtains, the scent of dry pine wood, and a thin blade of sunlight cutting across the blanket. No iron bunk bed creaking, no crying children. I was myself, and I was here, in a city I had never set foot in, under a roof that was not mine, yet which gave me a strangely profound peace. I sat up very slowly. My bare feet touched the wooden floor, and the cold made me shiver. I folded the blanket, smoothed the white sheet like a ritual. In the orphanage, the headmistress had taught us, a person is judged by how they leave a space after lying in it. I had never forgotten that. Even when no one was watching, I folded my blanket into sharp squares, placed the pillow on top, and pulled the sheet flat again. I threw both windows wide open. The sea wind rushed in, carrying salt and a faint scent of seaweed. The city below was waking. The orange roofs under the young morning sun looked as if they had been brushed with a thin layer of honey. A seagull perched on the sill, tilting its head to look at me with curious, fearless black eyes. I smiled. I tapped lightly on the glass. It startled, spread its wings, and flew away in an instant, leaving behind a tiny white feather drifting in the breeze. I stepped into the hallway. The 2 doors on either side were still closed, the rooms of the 2 young people Mrs. Ann had mentioned the night before. One worked at a bookstore near the park, the other at a tailor's shop by the square. I thought, perhaps in this very house, There were other souls wandering like me. Perhaps they too had once stood at a crossroads, holding a crumpled map and a single bag. My heart felt lighter, as if I were no longer entirely alone. At the end of the hallway was a small bathroom. I turned on the tap. The water was freezing cold, numbing my fingers, but I liked the sharpness of it. I washed my face, combed my hair, and tried to see myself clearly in the small oval mirror. I put on the neatest clothes I had saved from the orphanage, a white shirt slightly faded but well ironed, dark trousers without a single wrinkle, black lace-up shoes still new because I had only worn them on important occasions. I wanted others to see that I might have nothing in my hands, but I knew how to respect an opportunity. I went down the stairs. Each wooden step creaked softly, very softly. I tried not to make noise, though I wasn't sure who I was afraid of disturbing. Downstairs, the chandelier from last night still held a dim golden glow. And from the kitchen door, I heard the sound of tea being poured, a kettle set on the stove, a cheerful murmuring as if Mrs. Ann were talking to herself. I stopped in the hallway. It wasn't fear. It was unfamiliarity. In the orphanage, at mealtimes, we lined up. When we wanted something, we asked permission. When we wanted to enter an adult space, we knocked, we waited, and if we were not invited, we stood still. That was how we survived. That was how we avoided being thrown away. I stood at the foot of the stairs, gripping the banister. Through the open kitchen door, I saw Mrs. Ann pouring boiling water into the teapot, white wisps of steam rising into the morning light. She wore a dark gray sweater, sleeves pushed up, revealing her nimble fingers moving lightly over the pot. Her back was to me, yet she seemed to sense my presence because she spoke without turning around. "You're up. Come in. There is no door here that is closed to you." That sentence, simple, unadorned, made my nose sting. I let go of the banister and walked into the kitchen. The kitchen was small but tidy down to every corner. Copper pots hung on an iron rack, polished and gleaming. A cream-colored porcelain tea set with a sea blue rim sat in the table. On the wooden table covered with a burgundy cloth, she had laid out 2 cups, 2 deep bowls, 2 spoons. Balls of gray, moss green, and mustard yellow wool were gathered in a wicker basket, fluffy and soft, like cocoons waiting to become butterflies. Mrs. Ann turned around, smiling through her round spectacles. Her eyes were bright and warm, the way she looked at me without needing to ask questions. "Good morning. Did you sleep well?" "Yes, very well, ma'am," I answered, my voice small and polite. "The room is very warm and quiet. I have never slept in a room. That was only mean." I was the same once," she said, pouring tea into the cups. "When I first left home as a young woman, it took me a week to grow accustomed to the silence. I didn't know whether to pull out a chair or stand and wait. Some invisible reflex operated inside me. When you enter someone else's home, you let the host invite you first." I stood by the kitchen window, looking out at the small backyard, an old apple tree, a few pots of herbs, a gray stone wall covered in climbing vines. Mrs. Ann looked at me, unhurried. She set down the teapot and gently pulled out the chair across from her. "Sit down, dear," she said, her voice slow, each word carefully chosen not to unsettle me. "Here, you don't need permission to sit. You don't need permission to eat. I am inviting you to breakfast, so please eat. When you can provide for yourself, you will. But for now, let me take care of one meal." I sat down, light as a sheet of paper. Before me was a bowl of fragrant barley porridge, thick and golden, topped with thin slices of apple and a scattering of dried bilberries. She pushed the honey jar toward me. "If you like it sweeter, add honey," she said. I took the spoon, my hand trembling slightly. Not from cold, but because this was the first time I had ever sat like this, across from an adult, in the private space of a real kitchen, without dozens of other children jostling, without a supervisor shouting, "Eat faster, it's time for class." I ate slowly, spoonful by spoonful, trying to memorize the taste, the nuttiness of the barley, the tartness of the bilberries, the gentle sweetness of honey melting on my tongue. Mrs. Ann asked nothing more. She ate with me, occasionally sipping her tea, occasionally looking out the window. The silence between us, I had once believed silence was something to be filled, turned out to be surprisingly comfortable. Like two people sitting in a library, each reading their own book, yet knowing the other was there. After a while she spoke, not a question, but a soft suggestion. "I thought of a place for you. Mr. Thompson, the café right on the square where you stood last night. He needs an assistant. The old one just moved to the big city. If you want, you could go see him this morning." My heart beat a little faster. I set down my spoon and tried to keep my voice calm. "Ma'am, may I go right now?" "Of course," she smiled. "But before you go, I want you to know something. In this city, people notice how you bow your head and how you lift it. You have a very particular kind of silence. Not silence born of fear, but silence born of having watched long enough to know when to speak. That is rarer than charm." My chest tightened. I remembered the headmistress, the woman who had held my hand at the bus stop and told me I understood things to the point of heartbreak. I had never known what to do with that praise. But here, in this kitchen, Mrs. Ann spoke it as a simple truth, without worry or pity. I lowered my head. "Thank you, ma'am, for everything." You'll be fine," she said, standing up, placing her lined hand on my hair and stroking it gently. "Be confident. The work will require you to be much braver than this,